On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program writer, editor, journalist, and author of The Marginalized Majority, Claiming Our Power in a Post-Truth America, Anisha Roy Chowdhury. Anisha, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Sam.
All right, so let's start with the most obvious question is who are we talking about when we talk about the marginalized majority?
Yeah, I think we're talking about just historically marginalized populations in America. So that generally breaks down along the lines of like anyone who is not a white heteronormative man.
And there being a majority is nothing new, right? I mean, this is a dynamic I think that has been probably since day one of more or less in terms of our population, right?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And I think the issue is just that there has been historically an ongoing focus politically on reaching out to white male voters generally, or the issues that they're more concerned with. And so there's just this real dissonance between who politicians and pollsters tend to be targeting and who the growing majority of Americans are.
Okay, and part of that, it just occurs to me as you say that, like, what do you think why do you think that is? I guess for a long time, right? Over the course of our 200 some odd year history, I guess much more now, but I'm still thinking about the freedom train. But over that time, white males have been really, they've had the vote the longest, I guess. I mean, on some level, is there a certain amount of just sort of muscle memory here in terms of the way?
Yeah.
Just speak to that.
Yeah. I think that's a great and interesting way to put it, and I think it's largely true. I mean, we're just talking about really entrenched issues of racism and misogyny, and I think we're starting to, now that these topics are being more discussed, we're starting to learn new ways of being able to engage with these issues because, there's a lot of defensiveness around them. But the fact is, these kinds of forces are so baked in to who we are as a people in a country that, there's no one who doesn't have biases. So I think we need to, like you said, recognize that there's just a lot of muscle memory here. There's a lot of just erring on the side of thinking of Americans as this uniform population. And largely when we do that, what we're thinking about is the sort of white heteronormative sensibility.
How do you define identity politics?
That is a great question, and I think there are so many ways to define it. I think the way that I've been trying to engage with it is pushing back against a certain definition of it that I think is most dominant right now, which is this sense of a sort of precious, specialized need group. I think is generally how it's used, and someone like Mark Lilla really propagates this understanding of the term, and the understanding of that is the way that's made manifest is talking about identity as though it's something that gets in the way of unity. This kind of conceit that identity is something that we can take off like a sweater in a too warm room, put it to the side so that we can all agree on larger, quote unquote, more important issues. And the reason I'm pushing back against that is because when you look at history, when you look at some of the most successful movements of our time, they have hinged on identity, from civil rights movement to women's rights movements. We're talking about really profound changes that affected and benefited all Americans. And these all, again, came down to identity in a lot of respects.
All right. Well, so how do you, though? So you reject a guy like Mark Lilla, and just for the sake of the audience that doesn't really know him, I think he self-describes as a liberal. He's a professor and an author. But we have a similar complaint from, I guess, nominally the right on some level. people are on different places on the spectrum, but the Jordan Petersons and the classical liberals of Dave Rubin, and then through to Sean Hannity, I guess. But we also have one from left of guys like Mark Lilla, right? I mean, and so do you have a more affirmative definition of identity politics?
Yes, absolutely, and I'm glad you pointed that out. The fact that this is kind of a term and understanding that is resisted from all areas of the political spectrum. I feel like a lot of when I wrote this book, it came out of conversations with a lot of allies and colleagues of mine who identify as left and progressive. It is true that I tend to, when I get into these conversations around identity politics and there's resistance with those on the left, it is usually white men, though, even though they might fall further to the left on the spectrum. For me, my understanding of identity politics is that our identities as Americans and who we are and how we're acculturated in this society is inherently political. So if you are a black man and you grew up in this country, you exist in a certain America that is separate in a lot of respects from other Americans, which is you can expect to live a shorter lifespan, even though you make up a small percentage of the population, you're more inclined to be subject to police violence. So the fact is, when we talk about identity, it is inherently political. We're talking about the way you look to people dramatically changing your experience of the country in terms of resources afforded to you, again, just like lifespan, basic things like that. So I think when I talk about identity politics, I'm talking about how simply the fact of your identity is an inherently political thing, and it's an inherently powerful thing that if we recognize the impacts of identity, then we can, if we're thinking about the people who are most inclined to be not experiencing the full promises of America of like egalitarianism and opportunities for success, if we are looking at those issues and addressing them, then we're talking about making the country better for every single American.
So, all right. So, a guy like Lilla has a problem with identity politics because it creates divisiveness, which is, it's a silly critique in my estimation, right? I mean, because when we're talking about identity politics that have created the most divisiveness, it's really white identity politics that have almost self-evidently created this, right? It was white people who set up and institutionalized the various disparities based upon identity. On the right, it seems to me that the complaint is that by emphasizing these identities and acknowledging that white people set up these disparities, you are infringing upon white rights in some fashion or white privilege. Mm-hmm. But on the left, the argument is that identity politics should not subsume or crowd out some notion of class in its analysis. And I don't. And to be fair, I don't have the data in front of me, but I suspect that the disparity between black and white longevity is actually is less than the disparity of upper income African Americans to those living in the bottom half of the distribution. Although I'm not sure, but I'm sure. But I know that those two numbers are different. In other words, and maybe one isn't bigger than the other. But there is the lifespan is a function of income as well as race. Race may have more to do with. I just don't know those numbers, but certainly there's an element of class, right? Where does that fit in to this to the relationship between identity and class.
Yeah, I mean, class is a hugely important thing, and I think one of the basic truths here is still that if you are a minority, if you are black or brown, then you have a lower median income level in this country. And again, a basic truth is that as a woman, you working the same job as a man, you are paid a lower hourly rate. So, I mean, the fact is we're still at such basic inequalities here that are still true that, yes, I welcome a nuanced, class analysis when we're talking about who we're trying to connect to politically. But we're really just still struggling with some really basic issues when it comes to minorities.
Talk about use your relationship with your Uncle Bill as a metaphor of sorts. Just tell us that story, because it's I just found it like unbelievable in a way. But I mean obviously I believe it, but I'm just saying that was I think that was sort of intense in a way that it didn't seem like. But go ahead, please discuss.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting too is you say that, and I think as I got older, I started to think of it as something that became increasingly like, oh, wait a second, that's a little strange. But at the time, it was just normal. And I think so let me just tell the story before I say what it means. So when I was growing up as a small child, my father is Indian. He came from India in his early 20s. My mother is a white American. Her side of the family has been here for a few generations now. So growing up, when I would visit my mom's side of the family, there was an uncle by marriage, and he did not believe in what he called mixed marriage. And so what that actually looked like is that if we were ever in the same room or around a dinner table, he would not speak to me. He would just never look at me or address me. And so this made for some awkward dinners, but I just acclimated to it. So I learned to not engage with him either. I learned that he was just essentially a not someone who I would interact with ever. And again, this just did not strike me as especially abnormal until I got older. And as startling as it might seem to some, I think probably many or most Americans can relate to this. I feel like most Americans have a family member or friend or someone where there's some element of racism or misogyny in effect, because the fact is, again, it's so baked in to who we are, to this culture.
But I just wonder, in retro, were you conscious at the time that he wasn't interacting with you because of that, or was that something that you just like, oh, he's a weird guy?
No, I was conscious of it. I had a conversation with my mom, and so I knew that phrase, like, he doesn't believe in mixed marriage, was something I knew pretty early on.
But that's something I
was aware of it.
That's something that I think I don't know if most, but I think there's a huge percentage of Americans who don't have any sense of what that's like. It's one thing to have a racist uncle. It's another to have your experience structured because of it, right? Like, so, I have people in my extended family who I would say are were racist, but that never in any way implicated my life until
Sure.
maybe when I was older, and I'm like, I don't want to introduce certain friends to him. This guy, because but it didn't necessarily make me reassess who I was. And
I think that's why I chose to tell this story in the book, is that for those Americans, I think we're probably talking about mostly white Americans who may not have a sense of how these kinds of experiences are ones that we are exposed to right out of the gate in this country and then have to metabolize, which means navigating around them at a stage from such an early point that we're talking about you're basically reacting as you're forming your sense of self. So I hope that in telling some of these more personal anecdotes, it allows it like you say, it sort of makes visible something that I think so many Americans are raised with.
What? Let me ask you about this. The subtitle of the book, and I understand obviously that there's sometimes these are a function of your publishers and your editors, but I'm just curious, like why? And but you write about journalism, and you write about politics, but also you look at comedy too in terms of of perceiving, I guess, this struggle. I mean, why the part about post-truth America? Is that and how does that work in with these various, I guess, means of social critique?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So post-truth America, I felt like was an important phrase to include here because in a lot of ways, I feel like we are seeing journalists and for that matter, political comedy shows trying to keep up with what is happening. So, Stephen Colbert, when he first got his start and, he delivered the speech for the White House press correspondence dinner as this bloviating right-wing character, then when he started his show, we saw this character in effect. And the fact is that he began in interviews, he started to talk about his concern because the whole premise of the show was, I'm going to say these totally absurd things. But
you're talking about about the Colbert Report.
Exactly. The Colbert, okay. The Colbert Report. He's saying these things that he, that seem utterly absurd, but the fact was that it was becoming a mirror image of what was going on politically. So where is the satire in that? And I think when we're talking about journalism, too, this notion of a post-truth America, I think right now we're seeing a lot of journalists struggling with how do we respond to extremists who are in the White House? How do we, when we have extremists at the highest level of power, how do we then frame the conversation? And there's a lot of emphasis on objectivity and balance. And the problem is that these terms are very mushy. And what that looks like is even in newsrooms, a lot of times, while everyone seems to accept objectivity as something we should all aspire to, the term objectivity is never necessarily defined clearly. And when you have these mushy concepts in effect, what happens is you end up just responding to whatever the tone of the day is. So my sort of question is, okay, you want to have balance, you want to be neutral, but what are you balanced between? And I think what's happening is what is happening is that if you have extremists in power, they're setting, in a large respect, they're setting the goalposts of the conversation. So if we are then using that as one end of the spectrum of what seems reasonable or balanced, then we're going to be really far to the right. So I just feel like we need to really examine these concepts of objectivity and neutrality that we're aspiring to we need to look at what they're tethered to, because obviously what is objective, what is reasonable shifts throughout history. And if we're just using our current political moment as the thing to respond to, that's not a solid marker to tether ourselves to.
So I mean, this is a critique of the so-called objectivity and the he said, she said that certainly I think predates the Trump administration. Is it though that it's now we're dealing with like almost this problem, but it becomes just a lot more naked because on one hand you have reporters who have to report on the president who is out there saying stuff like, answering a question about hard Brexit, let's just say, and talking about how he's got a great golf course. And it's just so insane that it's almost impossible to sort of to actually report on this stuff. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like doing play-by-play of a monkey playing chess. It's just They threw the pieces again. It doesn't matter. I mean, why? But why does that critique of how does that relate to this moment we're in, where there is a maybe, I guess, a I don't want to say a resurgence, but an insurgence of marginalized power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you pointed out something important, which is that exactly that when you're looking at the he said, she said model, what you're getting is you're not getting much in the way of analysis, right? You're just getting quotes on quote unquote either side, and what that erases is the notion and reality of there being many more sides than just two. And also, you cannot just quote people without context, right? And I think that it's a heavier lift now. Like, our responsibility as journalists changes when we have, if we're say interviewing a white supremacist because it just so happens that someone who holds political office has some affiliation or connection to white supremacy, we have to then figure out how to put that into context. It is irresponsible to simply put a quote in there and make some loose connection. I think the shift needs to be towards who is most going to be impacted by this person in power. We need to look at the impacts of these kind of people and policies, and I think that's our responsibility as journalists.
All right, and so I mean, is this? And so when you talk about claiming our power, right? I mean, the our here is the marginalized majority and its allies, right? And that's certainly not the media, I think, at least like broadly speaking, right? I mean, it's just not. So,
right.
I mean, what is the mechanism for folks to claim their power when they don't necessarily have control of the media, or in terms of, like, say, comedy, you touch on this, and these sort of comedic institutions seem as politically active and aware as I've ever seen it in my lifetime. I mean, I think maybe in the 60s, you certainly had, like, in the early 70s, you had some, you had a certain political awareness, but it was not necessarily around the emancipatory, I guess, revolutions that were about to take place, right? I mean, the Smothers Brothers could get kicked off TV by Nixon, but it wasn't necessarily because they were, expanding the opportunities for marginalized folks. I mean, maybe they were a little bit, but that was not the main reason why. So what's the connection there? I mean, like, how do you at one time say to the powerful, like, you got to give up your power, and say to those who are marginalized, be aware of your power? I mean, where is that? Where's the lever there?
Well, I think part of how we claim our power is by recognizing that we are the majority, which is a really just basic concept. But I think the issue is that, again, when we're talking about the pervasive narratives that are out there, it is that, we have never been more divided in this country. Democratic and Republican Party, if you look at just the machinery, it's just, coming to a screeching halt. But the fact is that doesn't, and the media then tends to follow that and cover the story as such. But that's just following a certain narrative that I think is very outdated and dissonant. And I think we're seeing that, both in the presidential election, the fact that it was Bernie versus Trump, and now we're seeing in local elections, like we saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez win, and the way that she won was specifically by, she actually was on the Colbert late night show, and he was like, you were way down in the polls. How is it possible that you won? And she pointed out very astutely that, well, when we poll, people tend to look at the voters who usually come out, And she said, what we did was we got out the vote among different Americans. So I think what we're seeing is this dissonance starting to come to light, which is that we are very divided as Americans, but the divide is not necessarily between us as Americans, but more between the leadership that the majority of Americans want and need, and the leaders that are on offer at this point. But we're starting to see that change, and there are so many grassroots, local politicians now running and winning, and it's incredibly heartening.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we'll have even a better sense of that over the next couple of years. Unesha Roy Chowdhury, the book is The Marginalized Majority, Claiming Our Power in a Post-Truth America. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.